Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Max Ghenis, and I'm the founder and president of the UBI Center. We are a think tank, and I'm excited to share with you what we're about and some analyses that we've done using GitHub, Python, and Jupyter. So first of all, who are we? We are a think tank, and our mission is to produce open source research that informs a robust policy debate around the idea of universal basic income. And this is a policy idea that everyone in the society would get an equal amount, cash grant from the government, usually on a monthly basis. And especially excited to share with you because our origins are really rooted in open source. Personally, I worked at Google as a data scientist for most of my career. And throughout that time, I became increasingly interested in economics, economic policy, poverty, and how policies like UBI could improve situations like poverty and inequality. But I didn't really feel I had the tools to explore that until I found a group that works on this specifically called the Policy Simulation Library. And this is a group of economists that builds tools, open source, all in Python, to understand public policy making, especially economic policy. So I became really interested in using these tools for some of my ideas and also contributing to them. Long story short, I left Google, pursued my graduate degree in economics, and started the UBI Center about a year and a half ago. Our first paper, our sort of humble beginnings, really rode the wave of Andrew Yang, who was a presidential candidate for the Democratic primary. And he focused his campaign around a version of UBI he called the Freedom Dividend. It was $1,000 a month given to every adult, funded largely by a value-added tax, as well as some changes to other taxes and welfare programs. So we did the only distributional analysis out there of this policy, showing that it is in fact quite progressive, with the bottom decile over doubling their income and the top decile losing out. Now we have researchers all over the world looking at UBI from a variety of angles in the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, and Pakistan. Obviously, open sources enable this kind of collaboration, which has been really fruitful and exciting. A few of the projects I'll talk about today include simulating a child allowance across US states. So this is basically a UBI for kids, as well as comparing the $600 per week emergency unemployment benefits. This was part of the pandemic relief package in the US, to a budget neutral UBI. And finally, some dynamic macroeconomic modeling of UBI. So first on child allowances, I think the background here that's pretty important is that research has been very consistent, showing that child poverty has really deleterious effects on a variety of outcomes: educational attainment, lifetime earnings, health, both even child mortality, as well as long-term life expectancy. So a lot of countries, especially in Europe, have enacted a child allowance. So for example, Finland and Ireland give every parent a monthly stipend every month for every child that they have. And it has bipartisan appeal in the US because on the conservative side, they like the family focus. On the liberal side, it's more about reducing child poverty. And it's been actually a part of the Democrats' HEROES Act, which is the round 2 version of the COVID-19 recovery after the CARES Act. So what we've done is we've simulated different levels of child allowances. Here I'll show you a deficit-funded version where we also have some tax-funded versions, and it's pretty much the same story. So for example, California today has the highest child poverty rate in the country, 21%. And you can see how as you implement a child allowance, the child poverty rate continues to fall. So for example, at $300 per month, it has fallen to 10.5%. It's been cut in half. And if you have $500 per month child allowance, child poverty falls by 2/3 to 7%. We also have a tool where you can select any given state, so the US or any other state, and it shows the child poverty rate as a function of the child allowance as well as the overall poverty rate. Some other analyses as well are part of this deep dive into child allowances. So this is, I think, important from a policy level because you could imagine a child allowance that's national, There could also be states that try to implement child allowances to reduce child poverty in their own state, and this empowers people to understand the effects of those policies. So some of the tools we used, Plotly for all the visualization. Also, MicroDF is a package that we created to work with microeconomic data, which involves a lot of weighted calculations that aren't built into a lot of the default Python data analysis packages. This is all published with a tool called Jupyter Book, which we've been really enjoying working with, and it's all hosted on GitHub, so totally open source. Next analysis we ran is looking at the $600 per week unemployment benefits that ran from April to July 2020. This was one of the most controversial, also a very generous program that the US had as part of the CARES Act. So we simulated extending the policy, which there's been a lot of appetite for, comparing to also a budget neutral UBI, so giving everyone a smaller amount, but with the same aggregate cost, looking backwards from 2009 to 2018, where we have the best data on poverty. This was a little bit more involved in terms of technical analysis because it required modeling the unemployment benefits as taxable. So we use Policy Simulation Library's tax calculator for that as well. And our results essentially showed that compared to extending the unemployment benefit, we looked at two alternatives. So the extending it was the gray line, and this is looking at the change in the poverty rate. We also looked at the payroll tax cut, which has been an idea floated by President Trump at the time, and two versions of a UBI. So the dark blue is a UBI to everyone, light blue is payment to adults only. And these are all budget neutral, so the same total cost. But the payment to everybody actually reduces poverty 20% more compared to the unemployment benefit. And this was in 2009, which really has the most similar economic characteristics to today in terms of very high unemployment, really poor economic circumstances. Same results if you look at the poverty gap, which is another measure of poverty that counts how far below the poverty line different people are, and also inequality. So sort of on every distributional metric, a UBI is actually more progressive than extending the unemployment benefit, largely because there's a lot of people who are outside the labor force who don't benefit from the unemployment, or people who are low wage who also don't benefit. Finally, we looked at dynamic macroeconomic modeling, which would be really important if UBI were to get to the point where there's a law, legislation that's proposed. So any major reform, which UBI would definitely meet that bar, it would require probably a large number of tax reforms as well, is scored by the Congressional Budget Office and potentially the Joint Committee on Taxation. So there are some non-government models that do dynamic modeling as well. Penn Wharton Budget Model is one, and there's also the Policy Simulation Library's OGUSA open source model. All these do what's called overlapping generations models, where every person in the economy is optimizing for their lifetime utility. So how much they want to consume in each period or bequest to their kids. They're basically going to make choices in every period around their labor force participation, how much they save, how much they consume. And all of this affects aggregate metrics like GDP, labor, labor supply, investment, et cetera. So we found some interesting results when we simulated UBI. For example, consumption increased most for the poor when they're young and the rich when they're old. And overall, it's progressive. This was based on a pretty experimental implementation of UBI in OGUSA based on taxes. And we found some problems with that. So I'm really excited that we now have a research assistant who is implementing UBI directly into this program. So we're giving back to the open source community in that way. So our major goals for the future, of course, are number one is to inform policymakers and the public about the economics of UBI. But not too far behind that, we really want to build and contribute to open source economics tools. So contributing to groups like the Policy Simulation Library, as well as our own tools like MicroDF, and to demonstrate how open source can improve policy analysis so that other think tanks or maybe new think tanks like ours can consider the approach too. Not just in terms of short-term getting more eyeballs and reviews on different analyses, but hopefully recruiting people like me who may have an interest in economics and policymaking, either if they want to change their whole career or just have a small bite-sized project that they can get a taste for the realm. I think that'll really improve the whole domain. It'll improve open source and ultimately the public who are most affected by our public policy. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.